Yeah, I think one very important problem is that in the moment we recognize people who have effective power in developing countries as entitled to sell the resources of the country, regardless of how these people came to power and regardless of how they exercise power. And that, on the one hand, greatly supports oppressive regimes because they can make a lot of money from resource sales. And it also provides terrible incentives for anybody who is in a position to take power by force to do so, because they know they can then put themselves in charge of these resource sales and make a lot of money and stabilize their rule. It also is a great source of corruption, for the simple reason that anybody who is in power will have to pay off or try to pay off the people who could take power by force and thereby become very rich. So, for example, corruption is endemic in Nigeria because the government knows that any general could put themselves in power, and so they have to keep the generals happy, pay them a lot of money, because the generals could easily take power and then become very rich. So that's one very important problem. A second problem is the insufficient diffusion of green technologies. I mean, I take into the resource topic also resources such as water, soil, air, our atmosphere. And these resources are rapidly being depleted. We have global warming, climate change, and the attendant ills that affect, in particular, vulnerable, poor populations. And here I think the problem is that we are overusing resources, and also that we are not fast enough taking measures that we could easily take to reduce these climate impacts. And here what we should do is, I think we should make sure that resource-friendly or environmentally friendly innovations diffuse much faster than they are now diffusing. And one big obstacle here is the existing system of intellectual property rights, where you have patents that allow innovators to charge very high markups, and because of these high markups, the innovation doesn't spread. People wait until the patent expires and then they use it. And so what's really tragic is that you still have old-style power plants used all over the developing countries, where much more modern facilities would be available. But they built the old ones because the new ones are too expensive because of the intellectual property rights. So that, I think, is another major problem that contributes to climate change. So I see the problem in a somewhat unconventional way. So I would say that while many philosophers have thought about that problem in a philosophical way and have tried to figure out what are the claims that various stakeholders have on resources, so as you say, the people who live nearby versus other people and so on, my view is simply that we should go one level higher up, and we should say that any kind of way of dealing with resources, any rules that govern the distribution of resources are okay, so long as the distribution that results, not just the distribution of resources, but the distribution of life chances, is an acceptable distribution. So, and what is an acceptable distribution? I would say, as a minimum condition, the world should be arranged in such a way that human rights are fulfilled insofar as that's reasonably possible. In today's world, given the economic level that we have reached, given the technological and administrative capacities that we have, all people's human rights could be fully realized, and that's what we ought to achieve. And then the distribution of resources, the rules that govern resource distribution, who owns them, who has a claim to the proceeds, and so on, these questions I see as entirely instrumental. I don't think there's an inherently correct answer to them. I think they should just be settled in such a way that we achieve the desired result.
Okay.
Yeah, the basic idea is that we recognize all human beings on Earth as having an inalienable right to at least a share of the value of the resources that are extracted. Not the resources that stay in the ground, but the resources that are extracted or are used. Everybody's entitled to a share of that. That's, again, not a philosophical principle, but that is an institutional proposal that would be justified by its contribution to the realization of human rights. Now, this idea would mean that whenever resources get extracted, a certain amount of money is taken out from the value of these resources and put into a human development fund that will finance poverty eradication, development projects, and so forth, making sure that those people who are traditionally excluded from the benefit of natural resources, namely the large majority of humanity, do participate in the extraction, in the value that is being extracted. The advantages would be twofold. One obvious advantage is that we would raise a lot of money for poverty eradication and development. And the other advantage, equally obvious, is that we would slow the extraction of resources, especially those on which we put a high dividend, the ones that damage the present and future generations. So we could, for example, focus specifically on coal, which is one of the most damaging resources, and put a high dividend, extract a high dividend from that, and thereby deter the use of coal and accelerate, of course, the development of alternative energies such as wind, solar, and so forth. Yeah, so this hangs together with the thing that we discussed at the beginning, namely this idea of undermining or curbing the international resource privilege. This privilege that we assign to anybody who holds effective power in a country, namely the privilege to sell the natural resources, collect the money, and then use that money often for oppression and so forth. So the idea would be to make sure that those people who rule illegitimately, who take power by force or who rule through oppression, will not be awarded that privilege. Of course, we cannot prevent them from actually having the resources in their physical possession, so they have the resources if they want to, so long as they are in power. But what we should prevent is that they can confer legally valid ownership rights in resources that will then be recognized everywhere else in the world, right? So if I asked you to justify to me that the gasoline in your tank is really your gasoline, you will say, here's the receipt from Shell or Exxon or wherever you buy your gasoline. And then I go to Shell and say, well, how did you get this gasoline? And then they will say, well, we got it from Africa. We paid this dictator in Africa for this gasoline. And of course, this is what should not be recognized. All the courts and police forces in all the countries of the world will recognize that, in fact. But we shouldn't. Why should we recognize a person just because he got himself in power in Nigeria or in Equatorial Guinea or somewhere through force as entitled to have these legally valid ownership rights, so that his signature counts as a legitimation of Shell's possession of the oil? So that's what I want to avoid. Now, how do I want to avoid that? Basically, I want to say that poor country governments, developing country governments, either individually or collectively, should create certain minimal rules for when a government should be recognized as legitimate in their country. So the people themselves should decide if any government in the future governs us in such and such a way, you, the rest of the world, shall not recognize that government as entitled to sell our resources, because the resources, according to international law, belong to the country and the people where these resources are located. And if they made this clear, then of course it would be very much more difficult for rich and resource-hungry countries to buy resources and pay the dictator for it, right? Because the people have already declared that they don't accept that. And the democracy panel is necessary. It's basically a group of experts that are safely sitting outside the relevant countries that would announce in real time that a particular government or a particular set of rulers is no longer legitimate and so no longer entitled to exercise the resource privilege. This could happen through a coup d'etat, for example. Let's say some general takes over power in Nigeria, and then the democracy panel would say Nigeria is no longer democratically governed. Anybody who now acquires oil from the Nigerian government is not actually acquiring legitimate property rights in accordance with what the Nigerian people have laid down. Or if, let's say, a government gradually becomes undemocratic, which we have had in Germany, the Ermächtigung, right, Hitler, that something like that, of course, happens frequently in developing countries as well, that a government that was once democratically elected is now violating the constitution, is becoming oppressive, and so on. And again, the democracy panel would step in and declare in real time, from now on, any resource sales affected by that government shall not be valid.